Hello, and welcome back to the Staff and FaculTEA Sessions podcast.
What's up, y'all? Welcome to episode 5, The Wellness Mirage, a higher ed grift. I'm Chelsea.
And I'm Anna.
And we just want to welcome our listeners, welcome you back. Thank you for being a part of this bold truth-telling community where we spill the tea, not to gossip, but to transform.
And today we're spilling tea on how some of the colleges that claim community values are actually the ones that are exploiting staff, wasting and or hoarding resources, and of course, gaslighting all of us workers.
So hey, if this sounds familiar, share your story at tinyurl.com/tspillinghe or hit us up at Staff FaculTEA Sessions Pod. We now have a link tree, which has all the ways that you can reach us. So no excuses, hit us up.
Yep. And so today we're going to get started by reading our juicy story. Thank you to the anonymous contributor. And we hope that you can't relate, but unfortunately, we know you probably can. So here we go. Chelsea's going to go ahead and read it to us.
So I'm doing this in the first person in our submitter's voice. And we also got to meet with this person. So we're really grateful for this story. Here we go. So what do you call a place that preaches community but drowns staff in burnout while building infinity pools? Let me tell you a story. I once worked at a small religiously affiliated university in the Southeast. On the surface, it was all about community, service, and values. But behind the glossy brochures and recruitment videos, it was a financial and moral disaster. Let's rewind to the early days of the pandemic. Like so many of us in higher ed, I was doing everything I could to support students through crisis after crisis. But while my colleagues and I were losing sleep trying to keep students afloat, the institution decided that the best use of resources was, now wait for it, to build a brand new wellness center complete with an infinity pool. Yep, you heard that right. Meanwhile, staff, myself included, were furloughed for months, no raises, no retirement match, just a pat on the back, a reminder of how resilient we were supposed to be. I watched as they bought Uber scooters to make the campus look trendy, only to find that those scooters abandoned in a lake not long after.
What?
And while we were scraping by, they rolled out plans for an autonomous campus shuttle, because that's what really matters during a pandemic, right?
Definitely.
But here's where it gets darker. The university's leadership was a revolving door of dysfunction. The president at the time, who presided over this spending spree, was later ousted after a vote of no confidence. Guess where he landed? Another university presidency, this time at a private institution up north. No accountability, just a fresh start, leaving our crumbling campus in his wake. Enrollment? Tanking. Students couldn't afford tuition with so many cheaper competitors nearby. Our military-based partnerships closed down. And the cherry on top? Leadership would send recruiters to St. Patrick's Day parades in Boston, chasing wealthy families while ignoring the students right in our own backyard. And all of this while mold grew in our financial aid office's basement, where dedicated staff worked without complaint because students came first, even if we were last on the budget list. Through all of it, I kept asking, where's the accountability? And what became so clear to me was this: institutions that brand themselves as progressive or community-oriented can be some of the worst offenders when it comes to exploiting staff and gaslighting workers. So if you've ever worked at a place that used community as a shield while hiding shady decisions and screwing over staff, know that you're not alone. And know that our sharing our stories is the first step in demanding better.
Woo, that is quite the tea.
And again, this is the condensed version. When we met, this person was just bringing up like article after article and link after link and image after image. Like they came with the receipts. And when you saw all of this visually, it was just wild.
Yeah.
And when we saw this person, the image, right? It was like, well, grifters gon' grift. It was like
grifters gon' grift.
Textbook.
That's for sure. So again, if this sounds like your workplace or you have some other stories that you think folks should hear, spill the tea. tinyurl.com/teaspillinghe. Let's expose these institutions together. And we know this isn't an isolated story.
No.
This shit happens all the time. It's happening right now in higher ed. It's a systemic problem, and we need to talk about that, right? We are seeing increased nationwide layoffs. The Cal State and UC budgets have had their budgets gutted, and people are voting no confidence for their administration because we have no confidence.
Yeah.
So in May alone, there were more than 800 staff across colleges who lost their jobs, and that comes from inside higher ed. People are doing real work and are getting cut loose to allow leaders to protect their pet projects, grifts. The Cal State and UC system, one of the biggest higher ed institutions, according to Cal Matters, report that nearly $375 million in cuts were done at the Cal State and $270 million at the UC. This included layoffs, program cuts, and all of it is on the table. And then faculty at places like Leslie, Wyoming, and more are issuing non-confidence votes. Leaders are being accused of mismanagement, ignoring shared governance. Chronicle and Higher Ed have both covered it. Check out our show notes to check out the articles because they're good too. This is authoritarianism. The vote of no confidence is the democratic way for staff and faculty to call it out. What's happening? We've seen this trend, I think, rising in the last few years. We all probably know of or have heard of, somebody who has gotten a vote of no confidence in the last couple of years. And I think as we continue to experience the hellscape that is the current world politic, that's just going to get worse. So,
yeah. And again, going back to like that question of accountability, right? So folks get a vote of no confidence, which is a very public reckoning, right? If you think about like how diverse, say faculty are on a campus, right? Diverse viewpoints, oftentimes a lot of, dysfunction junction and people not getting along, whatever. And if they can all get together and agree on this one thing, most of the time, that's bad, right? Yes, there have been some instances where it's an abuse of power, but for the most part, this is a real reckoning for people who care about the institution, care about the students, to be like, yeah, basta. Like, no, you're done. And then these leaders just go on to other institutions and then other institutions. And I was like, I don't know if other people remember that, like, recycle, reuse, close the lid. I was like, this is the worst, aside from like your exes. Listen, I know we're at war, y'all. Don't text your ex, okay?
Don't do it.
Don't fucking do it. But like, this is the worst version of that ever. They just get to cause harm and then move on to the next one, and they just all get recycled through the system. And all this wreckage that gets left behind in terms of like human collateral. And then the next leader comes in and is like, why is everybody so pissed off? What's going on? And for the people that stay, right? The day ones stay in those institutions and try to hold it down while all of that chaos is going on, it takes a toll. And who gets to do that, right? Like, who gets to move like that? Overwhelmingly white folks.
Mostly white men.
And so if we think about the grift at the top right now, the grift happening,
just got a little thirsty,
I don't know, in the White House, and all of the henchmen, right, that are part of that cabinet. We call it not the DEI hires, like they've weaponized DEI, right? We call them the DUI hires. That like these men, these harmful white men, get to hold the highest offices in the land. And just like in higher ed, the people in the margins, the people that really care about the people are the ones that get harmed over and over again.
And just from like my own experience, I feel like generally the only people that I'm seeing being held accountable are people of color.
Yeah.
I have worked at several different institutions and have seen a lot of suspicious activities around hiring. And firing
Mhm.
or allowing people to resign.
Yeah.
And what that kind of looks like. And yeah, it's unfortunate that it really seems like the only people that are experiencing any kind of accountability, and sometimes undeserving accountability, because, you know, and again, this also goes to the middle managers a lot of the time. I think we recognize that y'all are in a position that is really tough because you have little actual institutional power, and you're like literally in the middle of the direct service providers and then the folks that are, you know, holding your job in their hands.
Yeah.
And so we do, you know, feel for you in that way, but like you chose that. So
Yeah.
figure it out.
Yeah.
I can't keep doing this. I'm not getting paid enough.
Trying to
down
act
this
my
way,
wage,
you know,
y'all.
exactly.
Trying to, like, if I chose not to ascend to those spaces, I shouldn't have to
do the
manage
work
up and do the work of those folks.
spaces. Yeah.
So yeah, it's really incredible. And then we see how, just like we've talked about this a little bit, you know, we had a representative at our institution that was a woman of color and totally stumping for right-wing politics and caused a lot of harm, right? So, you know, that reminds us that you don't have to be white to uphold white supremacy, and you don't have to be male to uphold patriarchal systems, right? We see that a lot of women are operating this way too, unfortunately. They see what's required, right? They want to be taken seriously. So they're moving in ways that really harms the people who are depending on them for their leadership. And we're seeing this a lot right now, right? We've got women who are behaving in ways that are really authoritarian, that are operating with a lot of racism, a lot of classism, every ism that you can imagine, right? And I feel like as a womanist, as like, you know, a feminist, like that hurts more, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, when you have the optics of a person really of any marginalized identity, it feels so much more harmful because I feel like it reinforces that structure of white supremacy, right? Like fill in racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever commentary. And that sucks. It's a lot harder to articulate issues because there's also all these other dynamics at play.
It's so messy.
Right. And so like it makes it hard to hold the leaders accountable because we're having to sit with what are we prioritizing and how is this contributing to the bigger picture goal? You know, like, it just puts a lot of extra strain on accountability.
Yeah. And who benefits, right? Whiteness
Every time.
You know, is going to win every time because, like you said, the people that are being held accountable overwhelmingly are folks of color for, again, doing usually far less in terms of creating harm than a lot of their white counterparts. And they're the ones that are being, you know, removed and undeservingly a lot of the time because stereotype threat is real. And so then, you've got a lot of these other leaders probably in fear, which I acknowledge and I understand, right? And
we're all in fear.
We're all in fear. And we can't succumb to that politic. We can't align ourselves with that way of moving because if we're really about liberation, right, then really we're just in this like capitalistic colonial where people are operating from self-interest. And that doesn't benefit anyone, even if it feels like it benefits you in the moment, right? You got a nice house, whatever. You're not living your values most of the time.
Maybe you are.
Yeah, but when it really comes down to it, or when you need help, right? And nobody's there for you because, hey, girl, like, you know, you chose this. You did this to yourself. Because Carmisha always spins the block. We're trying to remember that and hold that dear. That like Carmisha is always going to come around in one way or another. You're moving with this like rugged individualistic bullshit, especially in the US, has just got people just fucked up. What are people prioritizing?
Yeah. And I think that's partially why we feel so strongly about sharing these stories, because these stories are kind of the flashlight shining, you know, and like bringing attention to the chaos and the darkness that is behind the scenes in higher ed. And so like these stories help contextualize the issues that we are seeing arising on all of these campuses and in our greater political scape.
Yeah.
You know, everything that we're talking about is a microcosm of the bigger picture that we're all living through right now,
All
right?
connected.
And yeah, like today we're struggling a little bit because there's been a lot of shit happening.
Raids
Kidnappings continue to happen. And now we are considering war plans.
World War III.
You know, and like that's overwhelming. And so we showed up today.
Yeah.
To try to bring a little sense of like normalcy and hopefully help create a framework or a way to like participate in the resistance in some way.
Yeah.
That always makes me feel better to just be like, I'm not alone.
Absolutely.
And people are with me. And like that conversation really like sparked something in me and, you know, just made me feel less alone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And thinking about, right, our locus of control,
Mhm.
I think part of what's really hard right now is that there's so many things that are out of our control. And even with the stuff happening with ICE, we're finding out more and more about who these masked people are.
Bounty hunters.
Yeah, they're bounty hunters. They're people that are the mostly mediocre men. And so this is what they're doing.
Yeah.
And
speaking of financial grifts, all this money being paid to people that are not part of that government structure. DHS,
like to be violent,
blowing their entire budget pretty much already. Again, microcosm of what we're seeing at campuses, you know, and like our storyteller shared during the pandemic, having somebody purchasing these ridiculous things when there are literally people dying from an illness that we don't understand, that, you know, is highly contagious and transmittable. What was the motivation for all of that?
Yeah.
You know, there is no logical explanation. No. People are grifting. They are finding ways to funnel money in ways that maybe will go undetected and hope that nobody is going to check that out. You know, the presidents bring in their own cabinets, oftentimes creating a buffer that protects any nefarious actions that might be happening on the back end. And so, we want to encourage you to ask questions. Don't forget, the Public Records Act is a thing, and public institutions especially, but nonprofit institutions as well, are required to be accountable to the public, and we're the public. So ask the damn questions.
And I know a lot of folks that are living in red states, even purple states, like this is really challenging, right? To think about electing local leaders with a conscience, right? Electing local leaders that, you know, actually give a damn about these kinds of things. And that's one maybe silver lining, is when people are thinking about how to politic with their power. Oftentimes, you know, maybe being on a board of trustees is not like, you know, the place they want to end up, right? Maybe they want to end up somewhere else in terms of their political aspirations, but they'll often go through education first, school boards. So how can you get involved in your local elections? Again, thinking about how we don't have a lot of control at this moment about things that are going on at the federal level. But for a lot of us, election season is coming up again. So how can you get involved in maybe electing a board of trustees in your institution, if you're still there, or in your area, that moves with, you know, dignity? When we're talking about furloughing workers and then spending all this money on all this bullshit, you know, that was like a dereliction of duty for that board with their fiduciary responsibilities. What we did in our union when I was in the system was we created a political action committee, a PAC, and that allowed us to kind of work on elections and basically do questionnaires, do endorsements, you know, give small financial contributions. Then we would walk for the candidate, we'd phone bank all that, and it made a big difference. So we got to be a part of electing our trustees. And that's something that you can think about if you're, you know, in a place where you're frustrated. Well, how do we turn that into action? And in our questionnaire in particular, because we're a union, you know, we wanted to ask a lot about, how do you feel about workers? You know, are you in solidarity with us? Do you actually think that we're as important as we are? And it made a big difference. So just one way that you can think about maybe taking some of your power.
Yeah. And at this point, there's not a wrong answer except for doing nothing.
Yeah.
That is the wrong answer. We want to encourage folks to Google the ecosystem of activism and see the different roles that folks have available. We'll link it in our show notes so that you can access it easily. I think a lot of times the way that we frame what activism looks like is very narrow. And so people think it's me going out and protesting, right?
Yeah.
Or like putting my body in front of whatever. And yes, like that is a critical component and absolutely necessary, and something that all of us who have privileges need to be stepping up and doing. And for others who may not be safe to do that, or who, do not have full ability to participate due to physical, mental, emotional challenges, there's other roles that you can play in that, right? And those roles are key.
Yes.
How can you contribute to the movements that are happening in your community? Some people are healers. And so it's just being able to hold space for us when we're experiencing, harm and trauma and validating feelings. Like that is so powerful, right? Some people are good with like organizing stuff. And so like you might be the one who writes the newsletters to go out, who manages the volunteer lists, or, who does all kind of the back end stuff. We also have the caretakers who are going to be the folks that maybe are helping to provide meals for things, or childcare, huge, right? So like find your niche. It doesn't have to look any one particular way. Whatever you choose to do to use your gifts and talents to try to contribute to the resistance is necessary and welcome. So find your place.
We are all necessary. And I guarantee that as somebody who, can be one of those people that could be out in front, whatever, like a lot of people can do that. That's a lot of people that are drawn to organizing, build that muscle, right? But I don't know shit about like finance. I don't, I'm not as good at like the little sort of back end details that are required on a daily basis. Those are the people that we need. Right? Those are actually really the people that hold shit down. And those of us, typically the women that are in the background doing a lot of the caretaking, repairing relationships, things like that. I also invite other folks to step into that work. We had one action where like a bunch of the dads offered to do all the childcare. So it was like all basically cis men doing the childcare. And that was mind blowing, unfortunately, because you never see that. And it was beautiful. They were like having their nails painted with some of the girls and just doing things that were beautifully radical by just disrupting that narrative that like that work belongs only to women or non-male folks, right? So those are ways also just in your daily life that you can think about being disruptive to the hierarchies, to the patriarchy, to like all that shit that is present in our system. Just disrupt the roles a little bit.
And if you are a policy nerd, if you are a rule reader and interpreter, we need you too.
Absolutely.
And this applies at your institutions as well. There's constantly new policies being approved, new processes happening. And a lot of that is based in regulations and law. And unless you and those who are looking to change things are, in that world, you're not going to be able to intervene in that, right? So like learning how to connect policy, regulations, laws that we are required to uphold to the changes that we want to see, and like really juxtaposing those things and pointing out how current processes are actually misaligned with that is super powerful. And the other part of that is, unfortunately, a lot of times it's hard to hold institutions accountable when they're breaking laws and blatantly continuing to do all of this, but I still got to get in the fight.
Yeah. And just tap in, right? One thing I realized when I really got involved in organizing, I went to a city council meeting where there was something really big happening in our community. And one of my best friends, who's an organizer down south, had kind of called me in. And I was like, oh, okay. And I remember I showed up to my first city council meeting and I was pissed, at what was happening in that. I had no idea. I was like, just in survival mode, single mom, working all the time, doing a bunch of other stuff, who knows? But like, I just wasn't tapped into what was actually happening in my own community. And I remember just like, that was the day that I activated fully, because I realized that I didn't know what had been going on, that people's right to exist in our community was at stake. And, so then I kept showing up, or I learned how to at least like read the agendas, or like go on your website and read the board agenda to just start getting in the know. If
Surprise!
Surprise! We're paying all these people that don't do anything, but whatever's going on, go on the website and learn your board policies, your administrative policies, whatever they call them. Because these are, as Anna sort of said, these are your tools, right? These are your weapons for you to say, well, we say we're doing this, but we're really doing this. And it matters. Shining a light can change the course of things that are happening. And until we get to a place of like real accountability, real structures that honor that work, until we get justice, it's just us. So also manage your expectations, but that's the reality, right?
I mean, it may not make a world-changing shift in that moment, but all the little ripples do make a difference. And, it kind of reminds me of that starfish story where it's like you are on a beach walking and you see a bunch of starfish that have been washed ashore. And it's overwhelming because there's too many and you can't save all of them, right? Yep. But when you go and save some of them, then maybe the person who's walking behind you will see you doing that and they'll throw a few other ones in, right? Yep. And that makes a world of difference to the stars that did get thrown back into the ocean. And so we can't save everyone, but we can try to help create a wave of people trying to help each other and support each other and make changes that improve quality of life for all of us, because that's the thing, right? I've learned I cannot distance myself from anyone's struggle because all of our struggles are tied together and all of our abundance is tied together, right? Right now, we're in a moment where I think there's a major reckoning happening in terms of the way that our society is structured and, the way that we view money and community and all of that. And so I think the more that we can continue to kind of coalesce together and, align ourselves with people who are wanting the world that we want, there's more likelihood that that's to come. If we can actually create some synergy, if you will.
Working in those crusty offices because synergy. But no, that's not the kind of synergy they want. They don't want the synergy where you're set tripping on the system or even, cheese me at the water cooler to talk about wage inequity. They don't want that. They just want you all sitting in the same place so they can control you.
Correct.
So challenging authoritarianism, challenging all the isms, right? Whenever they come up. And again, there's somebody always watching. We just did a little reel about raising your mug, to your workplace bestie. And the moments where Anna and I were in the same room together and something popped off and she modeled something for me or I modeled something for her. And then we modeled that for other people. And people are telling us they learned so much from just being in space with us. Not that we're anything, but we couldn't help ourselves. First of all, it's just no, you bear witness to an injustice or something that's wrong or something that harms somebody, and you got to say some shit about that.
I've been doing it since I was little.
It's literally those little ripples. So we're really encouraging you to step into the tide because really with that starfish story, it's well, you saved that one, and it's not even about saving one another. It's about radically loving ourselves, each other, and believing that we can make a difference and that we got this.
Yeah.
We got this. It's the last battle cry. This grifter with his big white ivory teeth that were probably made out of some poor endangered species that now doesn't exist anymore because this fool, that person is a dying breed. They are becoming extinct, which is why they're fighting so hard to remain relevant. So think about that. We are in an extinction event and it is painful. And it is violent, and there is so much that we can't even keep track of it all, right? But we know that if we're moving in solidarity, if we're moving in truth, if we're moving in love, that we will win.
Good's got to come from that.
I believe that we will win. We have to.
Yeah.
We have to.
Yeah. And going back to the story and some of the pieces that are in there, the contributors shared how they were witnessing these ridiculous things happening. And because staff are overworked and sometimes uninformed, in these processes, I'll admit I was not familiar with the way that things work on the back end, the elected official component of it, like all these little pieces of it. And so as I learn more of that information, then, that helps me be more effective in the way that I need to show up. But I guess all of that to say, like, trust your intuition. You know what's happening. You know what you're seeing. You're actually out here doing the work on a daily basis. You know when your gut tells you that something about this doesn't feel right, it likely means that something about it isn't right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, you don't have to take on every fight.
Yeah.
And it's okay for you to ask questions.
Yeah.
I highly encourage you to ask questions in writing because, again, we know the treatment that can come from being curious and seeking answers and clarity. And you want to be able to document that stuff, especially if it comes up with actual findings, that result in some sort of accountability or scandal or whatever it may be, because people need to know that.
Yeah.
And like, we've had people reach out to us about folks that left institutions that we have worked at asking, background information. We're very cautious about, how we share, if we share that information. But I think we do need to have more open discussion and dialogue about who's out here being harmful over and over and over.
Yeah.
Right. We're not trying to cancel people. It's not about just publicly shaming and punishing folks. It's really about creating opportunities for folks to do better when they know better, being willing to own our mistakes and say like, okay, I need to do some reflection and figure that out. But when people are grifting and stealing money and resources from students and from staff and programs that often are lifelines for our people, that needs to be addressed, right? And I don't know, abolish prisons, but also like incarcerate those motherfuckers. Just kidding.
That's where it gets real messy. It was like when Stokely Carmichael talks about like the movement for nonviolence, right? And I'm not promoting violence.
Yeah, sometimes though.
He talks about like, your oppressor has to have a conscience, right? And so when we're talking about these kind of folks, right? When we're talking about these like narcissists, these grifters, they don't have a conscience. So as many times as we call them in, as many times as they, get opportunities to do the right things, they're probably not going to do that. Or they're just operating out of self-interest to a point that there's no right way to hold them accountable. Sometimes, you got to call a fool out. And that's the only way, because like we started with the title of this episode, oftentimes they're just trying to create the mirage, right? They're just trying to create the illusion of community, the illusion of sanctuary, the illusion of caring for students. And if they're not moving that way, then you got to find a way to cut that shit out, because we can't normalize it.
No, we can't. That really is the last piece, I guess, that I want to make sure sticks with all of us is do not allow the injustices that are continuing to rise to become normal. That is the intention of our current regime in power in our government. And it is the same thing that's kind of trickling into other structures that are hierarchical, which our institutions are. And we cannot allow the normalizing of abuse, of theft of resources, public resources, and the mistreatment of people and community. Do not allow any of that to become normal. Find the way that works for you to bring it up.
Let's set trip on the system. So I think we're going to take a deep breath. So we're going to think about things that we're steeping on, something for you to maybe steep on.
One of the things we struggle with is like figuring out, what does this accountability actually look like? How do we hold people accountable who don't have a conscience or a moral or a desire to, be filled with integrity and move with integrity? So I would love to hear from y'all. Have you all seen accountability take place in a way that feel good, in a way that is meaningful? Are there people who are maybe on the path to that we can intervene before they get to that place of like, I'm the most important thing and I will do anything for my own benefit, right? What are the ways that we can see the markers of people like that? And how do we, work with them to figure out how to develop a conscience and get them connected to therapy and whatever, right? Or how do we create a structure for accountability that doesn't allow these people to just continue rising through the ranks, right? Because they just leave wreckage at every position, often come and don't stay very long in places because structures cannot hold these leaders. That's the thing, leaders. You know, like our structures are not built for one person to be the sole beneficiary of what we're doing. And so when these folks come into our institutions, they are ruining our institutions. And so how do we fight back? What have y'all seen? Share with us. I want to know.
Share it, because when we look at like what's happening in government, you know, you start to realize that like every accusation is a confession. We keep saying this, right? And so thinking about, you know, these folks that talk this big game about doing all these, you know, the Doge thing and going in with like talking about fiscal responsibility and just blowing millions and billions of dollars on genocide, on war, while cutting from our most marginalized people. So have you seen this? Like, do you have your own story to tell? Even if you just in the comments, yes, I went through this too. I think that's how we're really building this wave to say we're not going to tolerate this.
Yeah. And because we know that oftentimes folks who question, folks who want accountability are painted in a way that's problematic, are villainized and made to seem, you know, crazy, contrarian, like whatever,
you're so difficult.
Divisive, difficult. Yeah, exactly. So again, our intention with this podcast is to make it clear that this is not a one-off thing. This is something that many people are experiencing. And again, reiterating, most of the stories that we have gotten are from people who hold marginalized identities. And that means something. That means there's a major issue that we need to figure out how to like dig deeper and rule it from the root, right? So you're even just affirming, liking our comments, our story, like the things that other folks are putting in the comments is a way to just be in solidarity with each other. And so we really, want to encourage you to just engage and validate when you feel connected to a topic or a comment.
So follow us on all the platforms if you can.
Really, mostly just TikTok and Instagram.
Okay,
forget Blue Sky. We're not doing that. And then the podcast, you can watch it on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts now. So make sure you check that out. And then we are also still doing the Raise Your Mug Mondays. So check out our Instagram for that post on Mondays and shout out your people. We'll have different things for every week to help you kind of focus in on the folks that are helping in that particular area. And, you know, we're not going to police it. So if you just feel like shouting somebody out for whatever reason, tag them.
We don't know them. Hopefully, maybe someday we will.
Yeah, exactly.
And just for some little teasers, things that we're steeping on, when we talk about accountability, when we talk about justice, we've got somebody in our network that we're hoping will come and talk to us about the amazing work that he's doing in the area of restorative justice. Just because, again, some of us don't even know what that looks like. And so if we can have different things modeled for us, maybe things that we can push for in our institutions, in our family systems. So let's see what it tastes like.
And also more to come around the HR piece. And how to be aware of your rights, your policies, and, you know, how you can use those to protect yourself. Because as we mentioned, layoffs are coming. And if you're not documenting your own successes, eventually it will come down to he said, she said, they said, we said, whatever. And if it's not documented, then you have no proof, right? So we want to make sure that we try to share from our experience what has been helpful, what wasn't helpful, and hopefully get to a place where people can hold their employers accountable as well.
You know how we did the little Step Brothers segment about the work buddies? It's the opposite with HR. Like, did we just become best friends? Nope. HR is not your friend. And so don't be like this one. Who maybe did some oversharing and tried to think that they'll see the light. Look at all these violations of things. And they're like,
not so much.
They're like the police, and they investigate themselves and decide they did nothing wrong. So take those warning shots. And as Anna always reminds everybody, keep your receipts.
There's an app for that. We'll put it in the show notes as well so that you can
Yes.
access it, and it helps you kind of track different things off your school platform as well, because we know they have control of all of that, right? And so magically, videos, emails, conversations, and chats can disappear, shockingly.
Like
so
a fart in the wind.
You got to make sure you have your own system for documenting and keeping your receipts in case they're needed. We hope they won't be, but we know they probably will.
That's why we keep a plan B around, right?
Yeah, exactly. Think about what your role is in this resistance. How are you going to, step into that and show up in solidarity with your community, with your campus, with your students, and then with the greater global community. We look forward to continuing these discussions. And as always,
stay rooted,
stay radical, stay resisting.